We have to make sure that this history is taught in schools. And it's not cute anymore to say we don't have time for teaching about Israel. It's not cute. It's not acceptable. It's not okay. It's not okay to allow our graduates to graduate from modern Orthodox high schools and not have a deep understanding of their own story. Because if they know their story, nobody could do anything to them. But they have to know their story.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. I recorded this interview with Dr. Noam Weissman on Monday afternoon, just a day after we learned about the terrible execution of 6 hostages right before they were discovered, presumably killed in order to make sure that they did not make it back home alive. Today, Hamas continues its psychological torture of Israel by saying that it will release video of these 6 victims. The pure unbridled evil implicit in these acts, and so many others, is a reminder of the existential battle that Israel is involved in every day against not just an enemy, but an enemy that advocates the elimination of the state of Israel and the extermination of its Jewish population. Alongside this, we've experienced the terrible disconnect that comes from seeing the way that Israel is often treated in standard media, the denunciations of Israel across social media, and the protests denouncing Israel and supporting Hezbollah and Hamas taking place throughout the globe. The side-by-side comparison of our experience as supporters of Israel, who are collectively in a type of mourning, and the demonization of Israel as a genocidal state that's the epitome of evil, makes the enterprise of Israel education in our schools more important and more timely than ever before. In order to discuss how our schools should be approaching Israel education, I was honored to speak with Dr. Noam Weissman. Noam offered some truly fascinating insights into the way that we should and should not teach about Israel, as well as the consequences of avoiding Israel education altogether. He also talked about the difference between being a Zionist and being pro-Israel, which I found particularly interesting. It was an enlightening and entertaining talk, and I'm sure that you'll learn as much as I did. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, this podcast is brought to you in memory of Mayor Ben Tudras. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Continue the discussion on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. In the past few days, I've published 3 new articles: October 7th in Kristallnacht, Everyone Deserves a Vacation, Right? And The Real Enemy and the Big Dilemma. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a very high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Noam Weissman is the Executive Vice President of Open Door Media, where he leads its educational vision with content reaching millions of young people globally through the Unpacked brand. As co-host of Wondering Jews with Michal and Noam, and host of Unpacking Israeli History, Noam facilitates discussions on Israel, anti-Semitism, and Judaism for a broad audience. He also spearheads Unpacked for Educators, a platform utilized by 10,000-plus educators worldwide, and recently launched Connect ED, a landmark independent schools initiative. A member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network and a Civil Society Fellow, Noam holds a doctorate in educational psychology from the University of Southern California and is a former principal of Shalhevet High School in Los Angeles. Dr. Noam Weissman, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Scott, thanks for having me.
As an opening question, before we get to our main topic, which is about Israel education today, I want to ask you about the curriculum company that you built and your role in formulating curricula for Orthodox high schools across the United States. I want to ask you, Noam, what prompted that endeavor and what was already missing that you felt this particular enterprise was necessary?
So years and years and years ago, in 2009, I got into Jewish education. I was supposed to be a lawyer, and I was getting married to a young woman from the Upper East Side, and her parents definitely thought I was going to be a lawyer. I said, before we do the first year of law school, the two of us said together, why don't we do something meaningful? And so we went to a fellowship and the fellowship was run out of Yeshiva University at the time. And we went to a fascinating place, an institution called Shalhevet High School in Los Angeles, and it was quite it was quite an interesting place, very different place. And we said, why don't do something interesting, be part of a fellowship, teach for a year. And in the first couple months, I started teaching. I remember I was just 23 years old, and I kept on thinking to myself, this school and schools across America define themselves as being religious Zionists, and and here's what the mission statements typically said: something like, "We're religious Zionists. We believe in the integration of modernity with tradition, and we believe something about the utilization or the making sure that women have a specific role in halacha and understand that and that sort of thing." And I would ask the school and I would ask other institutions the question, well, how does the curriculum match what the mission statement is? Like, just explain how it matches it, right? And so what happened over the years is I noticed really right away, something very interesting happened, which is that people would say, here's what the Talmud curriculum is. It's Masechet Kiddushin, it's Masechet Brachot, it's Masechet Avodah Zarah, and that's what we do. And then in Tanakh, we do Shmuel Aleph, we do Melachim, we do Lech Lecha, and whatever it is. I'm like, okay, cool. And I was just like, maybe a brash 23-year-old, but I was like, that doesn't match what you said. Now, they're great. Those are great topics, but they don't really match. And so
not to mention that that's not the definition of a curriculum.
Correct. But they're right. They're topics within, maybe not even topics, but they're sections within the Talmud and sections within. And then I would ask, like, well, explain. And then the honors track. So what's the honors track? Instead of two Mefarshim, instead of Rashi Tosfot, what you do is you add in, maybe a little Rabbeinu Hananel, or you add a little something, maybe the Mordachi at the end, something like that, right? And I was like, well, okay, but that's not a curriculum. And I saw this happening across the country. And so right away I said, okay, I want to create a curriculum. Didn't really know what those words meant at the time, but create a curriculum that was basically based on understanding by design, right? And said, but Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, I think that's how you pronounce his name. I don't know how you pronounce his last name. And well, tell me what the end goal is, and then create activities to get to that end goal. And so what we did, and I had a partner at the time named David Stein, who was my college roommate, and I was teaching there at the time. He was in engineering school at the time, and I launched this curriculum. I was just in this teaching these 11th grade students. I was 23, they were 17, and I created a curriculum where I founded this that said, let's figure out what's the nature, process, procedure of Jewish law? How does halacha work? What is the role of the rabbis in determining halacha? And then from there, figuring out how to apply that to modernity, to religious Zionism, to the role of women in halacha, to Shabbat and electricity and all of those sorts of things. So we created this curriculum. David joined the team at Shalhevet a few years later, and we created this curriculum, and it became something known as Lahav. I'm not involved anymore. Now it's David just does it, and I'm fully immersed in the world of Unpacked and Unpacked for Educators. But it was that thinking back in the day that basically this is the main point always for me, which is, how do you meet young people where they are? How do you match the goal to the activity? How do you make sure that you're doing more weaving and less spinning? And how do you make sure that you meet issues head on in a systemic sort of way? And that I have found to be the major challenge of Jewish education, of Israel education. But that's just, I started from Tanakh, from Talmud, or Gemara as we call it, Jewish philosophy. And then finally, I wrote my dissertation at USC on the topic of Israel education and applied those same exact principles to teaching about Israel, which I saw as a major, major problem in the Jewish world, and said, okay, let's be systemic about how we teach Israel. Let's be systemic about how we meet young people where they are, because the bottom line is, really the point I'm always trying to make is, we have to make learning engaging, interesting, meaningful for our young people, and we have to pay close attention to what our goals are, and then to say, whatever those goals are, And every school has the right to determine what those goals are. Make those activities meet those goals. Don't just do random activities and say, oh, we're, hitting those goals in some sort of, ethereal way. No, have those goals set up from the institution's perspective, have the mission, have the vision, and then have the curriculum, the content, the hallways, every single thing that we do systemically meet that moment.
Noam, I didn't know this would happen, but you're completely speaking my language. Before I was promoted to podcast host, I used to run a yeshiva called Yesodei Torah here in Beit Shemesh, or right near Beit Shemesh, and our entire mahut, our entire essence, was trying to create a curriculum in the true sense of the word to teach skills and other things. A curriculum is not Baba Kama. And teaching skills does not mean teaching Baba Kama a little bit slower. It means figuring out what works, how to transmit whatever needs to be transmitted in order to accomplish that particular goal. So I am very much on the same page as you are right now.
Scott, you were the ones that had that card, right?
Yes, we had that card.
I remember that card. You know what? I'm just thinking about it now. I used to promote your yeshiva so much back in the day because I would say, this is the yeshiva that has a curriculum, that has a methodology, and that you could say by the end of it, here's what the goals were, and it's written out, it's systemic. Here's the number, maybe like the number of ideas, the number of rabbinic phrases that you will be able to master in order to say, I know how to do A, B, and C towards a broader goal. So yeah, Scott,
thank you very much. Those were our cards. I have to say, my partner in the yeshiva, Rabbi Pesach Wulicki, he was really the one who spearheaded and had the idea of those cards. My name is first on them because K comes before W, but he was really the balabite for that one. But thank you very much. I appreciate that. Let's now get into Israel education, because that's our main topic for today. And right now, we're recording this on a very, very difficult day. We're recording this on Monday, September 2nd. It's the day after we found out that terrible news, I guess 2 days after in the United States, about the discovery of 6 hostages who had been brutally murdered, presumably only a day or two before they were discovered by the Israeli army, and also presumably in order to prevent the Israeli army from finding them alive, just savagely killed. It's awful. And at the same time that we're mourning this across the Jewish world, people are now going back to college, once again experiencing the anti-Semitism that we saw last year. It's continuing. Protests painting Israel as a militaristic, warmongering nation committing a genocide, and the disconnect that our students in high school are receiving between these messages. On the one hand, looking at Israel as, I hope, the good guy, versus the way it's often portrayed, especially among young people, as genocidal, is a very, very difficult thing for them to deal with. And I'm mentioning this, I think it's a proper introduction to the kind of thing we need to talk about today, Noam, when we talk about Israel education and how to transmit messages about Israel. So speaking about the current war as a starting point, what are the most important ideas about Israel and what's happened post-October 7th that you believe that our educators need to convey to students?
There's so much here, Scott. I mean, you just ran through a lot of different major concerns. The painting of Israel as the bad guy, and that we're seeing in many different places. The challenge of how to talk about the war, perhaps from a psychological perspective, and then there's the broader question, which is talking about the war within the context of the story of Israel, right? So that. Let's go through a few of these topics, and just interrupt me throughout, please, because I could, if you put me up for too long about a topic like this, I will just keep on going until you shut me off. So
that goes against my normal method of interviewing, but thank you for the warning. I'll do so.
So that's what. So do whatever you got to do. So so let's talk about the war for a second and how to talk about the war, and my concerns. My concerns about talking about the war and teaching about the war, not talking about the war, educators teaching about the war. What are the ideas that educators must convey to students, you ask? Well, they have to know the story of Israel. They have to understand why Israel exists, why the story of Israel matters, why Zionism. Then we have to talk about the how to do that in the classroom experience in the schools. We should then go into the what, and the primary real concern is the who, meaning who are these young people? The bottom line for me always is thinking about the market before thinking about the product. So we have to be thinking, who are these young people? Who are they? What do they know? What do they not know? what moves them, what hurts them, what concerns them. And we have to do a good job making sure that we're talking to them. So what we know from these young people is that they are going through their identity formation years, right? So we know that about them. We know that this is something that Eric Erickson has written about, where they're going through identity exploration. And specifically, I guess someone who would define himself or describe himself as a top student, James Marsha, would then explain how there are just four different types of identity that people go through: identity foreclosure, identity diffusion, identity moratorium, and then identity achievement. Okay. And so these are different parts of young people's lives, of adolescents' lives, in which they have different elements of identity. So identity foreclosure is when there's high commitment of an issue, whatever it is, and low exploration. Identity diffusion is low commitment and low exploration. Identity moratorium is when there's a tremendous amount of exploration, but a low commitment to an issue. And then identity achievement is when there's high exploration and high exploration and high commitment, right? So we want to help our young people not snap judgment, not like right away. What do you think about Israel? Let's make sure that everyone understands that Israel's the good guy, Hamas is the bad guy. Go. Now, I told it to you. Now you know that? Good. Now you know that. No, done. That's not the way human beings work. We have to put our young people, let me say it better, we have to give permission to our young people to have high exploration and high commitment. And there's no shortcut to that. We have to do the work. We have to put in the time, do the work. We have to do better, and we have to do it. We have to really do that. And so what that means is education becomes a full contact sport, right? That's what happens.
I would suggest that too often in the Orthodox world, we're not so into the high exploration. We're okay if you have high commitment, and we will talk about something, but we won't explore outside the bounds of what's acceptable. Do you agree with that?
Exactly. I mean, I see that very often, Scott. That's exactly what I'm saying, because I see that sort of thing very often. And so what we do is, and we could get into the reasons for that, but what we do is we go into what's called advocacy mode as opposed to education mode. And that's when I think we fall into a little bit of a problem, because we don't do advocacy. Let's talk about. Okay, so the world of Israel education, lowercase e in this context, is divided into four different categories. Okay, there's advocacy, there's studies, there's branding, and there's capital E education. Okay, and what's typically done in the Orthodox setting, though I do want to give credit to the Orthodox world because I see less and less of this in the classroom. But when I started writing about this and started talking about this, the way to teach about Israel was through advocacy. Hamas is bad, Israel is good. Der Yassin never happened. There's no such thing. When they say occupied, you say disputed. And I'm not saying these things are wrong, but if you think of the language and the tone that I just used, I spoke from a training perspective. I was training you, right? I was teaching you to defend. And then so that's the verbal use, defend or train. Okay. And then there's something called Israel studies, which is to analyze, right? That's the right verb with regard to Israel studies. Israel studies should be done in the college setting. Now, too often, that's not what's happening. What's happening in the college setting is people are doing not education. They're doing, and they're not doing analysis. What they're doing is they're doing brainwashing from the other side. And then there's something called Israel. It's reverse advocacy, or no, it's advocacy, but for the other cause. It's the same advocacy, but for the opposite cause. And then there's Israel branding, which is basically marketing and advertising. And it's like, and by the way, none of these things are bad. I want to be crystal clear to your audience. None of these things are bad. Advocacy is not bad. Studies is not bad. Branding is not bad. But so let me give you an example of Israel branding. It's like, so I was just with a group of non-Jewish people, and one of the people in this non-Jewish group said, I feel uncomfortable going to Israel because I'm a lesbian and I feel like I'll be persecuted there. And I held back my laugh, like I just chuckled, but I was like, oh my God, the Israel branding, like cue it. Here we go. No, actually, Tel Aviv is 25% gay. It is the LGBTQ capital of the Middle East. And basically, Israel branding would be marketing, advertising, making sure that people understand that it is not this backward, rough water, barbarian place that is a theocracy. That is called Israel branding. Okay. And they all have different places, but Israel education is a different sort of beast. It's
Although,
not
can I say one
training.
thing, Noam? It could be that
Yeah.
Israel branding for someone who's in the more Haredi community outside of Israel would be the opposite, to tell them that it's not a secular bastion of
Right.
LGBTQ values. It actually has Yerushalayim and Mea Shearim. It is a theocracy of sorts. I mean, it
What,
depends on who you're talking to.
so right. So again, that gets into the market product issue, Scott, right? You have to make sure you don't start talking until you know who your audience is. You really have to know who your audience is and then speak to your audience. I don't view that, by the way, as dishonest in the slightest. I think that that's just called good education, right? The way I talk to different people who have totally different backgrounds, totally different prior knowledge needs to look different, right? That's a move on by love. That should be self-evident, but it's often really not. But if you do Israel branding, you have to be very, very careful about who your audience is, exactly like you said. Israel education, though, this last part of which is really what my focus is it's not training, which is advocacy. It's not analyzing, which is studies. It's not marketing, which is branding. It's education. Education is cultivating their identity. Okay. That's the idea. The operative verb is to cultivate. So when we're talking about the current war, we want to make sure that we cultivate their identity in a way that is healthy for them, in a way that they are not defending or training. You could do that elsewhere, but they're understanding. They're seeing how their story fits into it. They're understanding the history as it relates to it. They're understanding what Zionism is and what does it mean to be a Zionist. They're understanding basically how they see themselves within the story of the current moment. And what this, I think, prevents is a concept that I recently learned called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue. It's so interesting, Scott, because I just thought of this recently as it relates to the current matzav, to the current situation. Compassion fatigue is basically exactly as it sounds. I help run a nonprofit, do a lot of interesting, hopefully moral, emotionally sound things that are important for the world. And every now and then I could get exhausted. Compassion fatigue. Well, someone recently said to me in South Florida, they said, I don't want to go to Israel events anymore. I said, why don't you want to go to Israel events anymore? They said, I'm exhausted. I don't want to help anymore. I'm exhausted. And I thought about it like this. You feel exhausted because you feel external to the moment. But if you feel internal to it, if it's your identity, you're part of Amcha, you're part of Am Yisrael, then there's no compassion fatigue because you're the one that needs the compassion. You're not giving the compassion. It's you. It's part of you. It's part of your identity.
Very
right?
interesting.
And it's only if we speak about Israel and Zionism and cultivate our identities that it's really part of our story, whether we live in US, Canada, UK, Australia, South Africa, it doesn't matter, but it's part of our identities. We're the ones that need the compassion. We're not the ones giving the compassion. Then
There's in a lot of ways, it's
story.
the difference between sitting Shiva and visiting a Shiva house. In one case, you're
Yeah.
trying to make someone feel better, whereas the other place, you're the one who needs that compassion.
Exactly. Precisely. That's how I'm thinking about it.
I'd like to understand better, how do we cultivate that? When you're talking about education as a type of cultivation, for someone who hasn't necessarily been to Israel, and certainly when we're talking about North American education, the vast majority have not lived in Israel, even if they have maybe visited. How are they supposed to see themselves as part of the Israel story, a country that's 6,000 miles away, that is treated in the day-to-day news often as a type of pariah, at least for some of them, at least in some places? Cultivating that sense that this is part of your story must be very difficult. How do you do that?
Scott, do you think that that the Orthodox Jewish world, when they hear that Israel's a pariah state, how do you think that the Orthodox teenagers typically respond to that?
I'm actually curious to find out. I'm guessing that it depends on the teenager, it depends on the school, it depends on the community. I don't know. I'm assuming that they immediately revert to advocacy if most of them have a certain type of identification with Israel, but it can't help but permeate on some level. There's some sort of osmosis. You hear it enough times, it's hard to necessarily believe your own advocacy.
Well, so I'll tell you what I have found recently, which was a new moment for me. So I was with a bunch of these Orthodox Jewish day school kids that go to sleepaway summer camp. And I asked this question about how do they deal with the question of is Israel an apartheid state? And we have a lot of content and curriculum on that on the Unpacked YouTube channel, on Unpacked for Educators. Got a lot of it. And I got for the first time an answer that I had never heard before. So how would you normally deal with this question? Is Israel an apartheid state? You would look at, well, you would say, study Israel. Is it a democracy? Look at the Declaration of Independence. Look at the history of the Six-Day War and the aftermath. Understand the territories. Um, Understand why some people call it an occupation, why some people call it disputed. Be able to look at the history, demonstrate that within the Green Line, all Arab citizens of Israel can do what Jewish citizens of Israel can do. Same with the Druze, same with the Circassians. Look at the Supreme Court, look at political appointees, look at all of that. And then you go into the issues of the West Bank and you say, ooh, Area C, that looks a little complicated. What's the deal with that? Then you go into the history of how we got there and how that's a disputed moment and go through. Okay, fine.
And of course, you have to also look at the definition of the word apartheid.
Then, sorry. So you start with, thank you, Scott. You start with what does the word apartheid mean, and you do all that. So I got an answer that I'd never heard before. I've been doing this for years, where a number of Jewish students looked at me and they said, well, the Palestinians are terrorists, so they deserve apartheid. And I said, whoa, this is a new moment. This is a new moment in time in which you have either heard such a one-sided narrative of the story, or you have been browbeaten so much that you don't even understand the words you just said and the consequences of the words you just said, that Israel has a right and a need to impose an apartheid. They weren't defending, they weren't arguing that it's not an apartheid. This is the first time I ever heard this. They were arguing for the need for an apartheid state. And I actually was caught in my tracks. I'd never heard that as an answer to the problem, to say, no, it's everyone's debated, well, is it? To what extent is it? Oh, it's not at all. Okay, fine, I get it. They were saying, no, the antagonists are right. Where they're wrong is that it should be the case. And I said, we got to go back to square one. We have to go back to square one of understanding morality, understanding ethics, looking at our great Western tradition and our great Jewish tradition, and be able to understand that this is the dialectic of being a Jewish and democratic state is at the heart of everything. But they have been browbeaten into having to be supportive or defensive. And that is, I think, out of this advocacy orientation. And also, I want to say, out of this nonstop battering of the Jewish people in Israel. So how do we deal with this? How do we cultivate an identity that's healthy, that's democratic, which I deeply believe is core to the whole experience, which is powerfully Jewish? It's really to do something that we haven't done enough of, which is to follow the story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Which you know the story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'll share it, but I love this story. So I was at this school. I was at this really awesome school giving a talk on Israel and the current moment. And I was moderating a panel. And on this panel, the question was, what should the role of Jewish Americans be as it relates to Israel? Should Jewish teens be there, support everything Israel does and like be the defenders of Israel, or not? So the two panelists said, yeah, that should be the role of American Jews, is to support Israel. Whatever Israel does, it's your job to support the Israeli government. That's your job, right? So I was the moderator, and I'm not supposed to give my opinion when you're a moderator, but I couldn't hold back. And I said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is the worst. That is the worst educational approach I can imagine. I understand where you're coming from, but I said, okay, here's the story. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is meeting a young Jewish kid who's about to become bar mitzvah. Okay, he's about to become bar mitzvah, and his father brings him to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They had a friend connection, and in this friend, and they bring him to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says, he's trying to make small talk with the boy. And he says to the young boy, he says, so tell me what you're interested in. He said, I like baseball. So the Rebbe says, so did you ever go to a baseball game? And he's like, I actually just went with my dad. And the Rebbe says, how was it? He's like, well, we left after the sixth inning. The Rebbe's like, I don't get it. Why would you do it? He's like, well, it's because, our team was getting killed. It was like 9-0. And so we just left after the sixth inning. The Lubavitcher Rebbe looks at the young boy and he says, did the players leave also after the sixth inning? And the young boy goes, no, they're playing. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, let me tell you what it means to be Jewish. What it means to be Jewish is to not be in the stands, but to be playing in the field. That is one of my favorite Lubavitcher Rebbe stories, because what it does is it tells you what what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Zionist, what it means to care about Israel. It means you get in there. You get in there. You play the game. You are not supposed to be quietist. You're not supposed to be passive. That's never been the story of Zionism. And even for American Zionist Jews, we have to make sure that they have opinions, that they cultivate their identity, that it matters to them, that they might disagree with something, but they're in the game. And so to be in the game, they need three things. They need content, they need curiosity, and they need courage. If they could have content, curiosity, and courage, if they know their history, if they know their story, if they're challenged to be curious, if they're challenged to be courageous and see ideas on different sides, then they are in the game. That's what we have to do, Scott.
Okay, Noam, so I'm going to play devil's advocate over here because that sounds great. And now I'm going to say a different perspective. I'm coming from an Israeli perspective. I've lived here for about 28 years. I think that Americans feeling that they have a full stake in the game is fantastic. That's exactly what we need. And I also sometimes feel resentful when Americans tell Israelis what they should do when we're the ones who have to bear the brunt of their perhaps wrong opinions. If they start telling us follow policy A or policy B, but the ones, if the policy doesn't work, are us who are going to have to live with it, that's something which bothers me, and I think a lot of Israelis as well. So how would you answer that problem?
Listen, we're part of the Jewish people. We're that's who we are. We're all part of Knesset Yisrael. And I think that there has to be humility. I think that there is a distinction between the Israeli experience and the American Jewish experience. Of course there is. You send your kids to the army. We send our kids to Shana Aleph and maybe Shana Bet, and then maybe YU, and then maybe University of Maryland, Penn, Brandeis, wherever. Like a little humility. There needs to be that in the process. So my response to what you're saying is, yeah, agreed. We should be more humble. The American Jewish people should be humble before it says, here's what you should do. I 100% agree with that. What I want to just pose is the consequence for asking the American Jewish people to be passive. And I think one of the consequences of being passive, no matter what, is disinterested, is apathetic, is not really being in the game. The reason I fell in love with learning Gemara and learning Tanakh and learning Jewish philosophy is not because I was told when I was learning any of these subjects, hey, here's the way to think about it. Now recite after me, repeat after me. There's nothing engaging, intriguing about that. I'm out. If you want me to do that, I'm out. I'm not going to be your parrot. I'm not going to just emulate what you want me to say. With due respect, it's not happening. It's not interesting. It's not engaging. When we teach about Israel, this is part of the challenge of the Jewish people coming back, and part of the challenge of the Zionist stories. The Jewish people are now front and centered, and the Jewish people now are agents of their story. They're not passive recipients of other people's stories and have this, side role in this grand theatrical experience that we call living the daily life of living in the world. They're now center stage. Well, we're not going to be center stage and be in the audience and cheer and clap when everything is good and jeer and cry when things are bad. Because if we expect that from people, then there will be not much left. And so that's the consequence. And the Israeli people could ask their American Jewish brethren, is that the consequence that you want? Because we have seen that 20 years of being on the sidelines since the Second Intifada and saying, hey, please just support everything that we do. We've seen the consequences of that approach.
I think that's a really, really good way of dividing that baby, so to speak. The idea of humility, but at the same time, making sure that you're able to fully explore it and express your opinion sounds very reasonable to me, which brings us back to what you mentioned before about identity achievement and the importance of exploration. You mentioned before Jewish philosophy, so we can discuss it in the context of Jewish philosophy or in the context of Israel education. You're allowed to explore too often in education as long as you come to this conclusion like the Rambam or whomever. Right. You can explore, but don't go past this line. There's sort of this nice thing that we say, Judaism encourages questions. And too often, I think we encourage questions unless you go too far. You start asking things we don't want you to ask, or you find answers that we don't want you to find. I'm not suggesting that people become heretics, but the idea of exploration, I think, has to be opened up a little bit in an age where information is available to everybody. So that leads me to the next question in terms of that fine line between exploration and advocacy. How do you try to make sure that you point students in the right direction so that even though they can explore as much as they want, they don't end up believing what people on the far left or the far right will say about Israel, these things which we would find to be disgusting and completely incorrect. But when you open up education such that people can explore in any direction that they want, we hope that they'll come to the conclusions that we believe in, but there's no guarantee. And especially when we're talking about young people whose minds may not be as well developed and who may be, this can apply to older people as well, but who may be unduly influenced by popular culture, by celebrity culture, by other people who advocate positions that are at odds with the positions that we would like them to believe in, there may be a real problem. How do you, I'm not going to say ensure because there's no guarantee, but how do you direct people in a certain way so that they will come out, quote unquote, pro-Israel with a positive attitude towards Israel, and they won't inculcate or imbibe those negative stereotypes that they'll often hear in the media?
No way to prevent it. No way to prevent it. The best way to cause it, I believe, is to tell them a one-sided story. But to prevent it, there's no way to prevent it. I'll prove it. I said I'll prove it. Now I have to really back that up. I spent 18 years of my life in an Orthodox Jewish environment. And then I went Shana Aleph to yeshiva, great yeshiva. And I spent one Shabbat at my aunt and uncle's house in Jerusalem, in Baka, who are good friends with Rachel and John. So that's the area that I spent the Shabbat. Okay. That Shabbat, I saw a book in my aunt's in her bookcase, and it said, "Who wrote the Bible?" That's the book. Who wrote the Bible? So I looked at that book and I was like, "Who wrote the Bible? This should be less than a page." God, bro, God wrote the Bible. Like that. Like what do you? I imbibed the whole book, had a panic attack, went back to my yeshiva, and said, "Yeshiva, doesn't seem like God wrote the Bible." And they're like, "Where'd you learn that from? Where'd you like your school? Did you go to school that taught you that?" It's like, no, actually a book taught it to me. After I did the whole yeshiva, Shana Aleph, from post night Seder, still learning thing, like still I was in. But the second a book is accessible, aka Google is accessible, aka TikTok is accessible, there's no such thing as playing the prevent defense game anymore. That's over. That ship has sailed. So
I agree 100%.
In the advent of, thanks to Johann Gutenberg, the reality is that what I'm saying is not that fresh of an idea, but it's Allah haskama v'kama in the world in which there's TikTok and Google and YouTube. Okay. So then what do you do within that? Now the question is, how do you communicate ideas? And what's the methodology? Okay. So how do you communicate ideas is let's stick with that. Okay. I love talking about parenting a lot. There's 4 different types of parenting. There's negligent parenting, there's permissive parenting, there's authoritarian parenting, and there's authoritative parenting. Those are the 4 different styles of parenting. Negligent that's the parent that basically says to themselves, you want to smoke weed? I don't even know. I'm whatever. Whenever you come home, you smoke weed at 2 a.m. I don't care. I'm not paying attention. The permissive parent says, what about smoking weed? Oh, you want to smoke weed? That's cool. Come smoke weed with me. I'm the cool mom. I'm the cool dad. Authoritarian parent says about smoking weed. Oh, you want to smoke weed? You smoke weed? I will kick you out of the house. You will never, ever step into this house again. You're done. You are done. That's authoritarian parenting. And authoritative parenting is a different from all 3 of those, which is a come with me approach. It says, here's what I think about smoking weed. Here's why I don't think it's of value. Here's the different perspectives on it, but still why it's my value in my home, why it's not the type of thing I want you to be doing. I want you to come with me and understand it. Okay. But I want to have a conversation with you about it. I want to understand you a bit more and have that conversation. Okay. That's authoritative parenting. When we engage with Israel, we have to remember a few things. Number one is, of those 4 parenting styles, I think authoritative is typically the most effective. Okay. But we have to understand a few things when we're talking to our audience. Remember with what I said earlier about VMP versus VPM. You have to have a vision, then a market, then a product, not a vision, then a product, then a market. So let's talk about the market. This market is a market that doesn't think of Israel the way you think about Israel, Scott. This is a market that doesn't think about Israel. Not that you were alive pre-67, but this is a pre-6. Very often, the older generation wants to tell the younger generation, "Don't you understand what it was like without an Israel?" No, they don't. Don't you understand what it was like without Jerusalem united? No, actually, I don't. Here's what I do know. I know that I'm born into a world that is post Second Intifada, that is post Oslo, that sees a very strong Israel, sees a lot of the world demonizing Israel, which is very hard to deal with. And remember, their Israel's not your Israel. So then what do we do about that? Well, we have to teach the history. We have to make sure, I can't stress this enough, Scott. We have to make sure that the time is now that they learn the history of Israel. We spoke about the curriculum design earlier. There is no such thing as expecting our young people to advocate for Israel without understanding the history of Israel, without understanding the story of the Altalena, without understanding the story of Kishinev in 1903 and Bialik's poem, Be'ir Hariga, after it. We have to understand there's no such thing as advocating for Israel without understanding the story of 36 to 39 and the major missed opportunities that existed with Haj Amin al-Husseini and not having Musa Alami as a leader. Major missed opportunities without teaching our young people about the Pantarim Shchorim, the Black Panthers, and the challenges of Mizrahi integration into Israeli society. Major missed opportunities to not incorporate the story of the refuseniks and what it meant to fight for your Jewish identity. We have to make sure that this history is taught in schools. And it's not cute anymore to say we don't have time for teaching about Israel. It's not cute. It's not acceptable. It's not okay. It's not okay to allow our graduates to graduate from modern Orthodox high schools and not have a deep understanding. I'll get to part 2 in a second, but a deep understanding of their own story. Because if they know their story, nobody could do anything to them. But they have to know their story. That has to be put into the content, the curriculum of their schools. And by the way, I'll just say this, and sorry if it comes across as a commercial. I don't care. It's too important. But Unpacked for Educators, the curriculum company, the content nonprofit that I lead with my team, Sarah Gordon and Avi Posen and many others, is to make sure that they have this curriculum in their classrooms. Because if they don't do this, it's a little bit silly to ask people to advocate for Israel without knowing the story of Israel. The same way, Scott, that we wouldn't do, just think about the Bible criticism example I gave earlier. The Bible criticism I gave earlier was, wait a second. Okay, here we go. Imagine if schools said the following: we want you to go to college campuses and demonstrate and advocate to make sure that every single person knows that God wrote the Bible through Moses, and there's J, E, P, and D. Ridiculous. Not a thing. Not true. There was no redactor. Insane. We want you to do that. And then the parent raised their hand and said, cool, I like that idea. Let's make sure that they know that God divinely dictated the Bible to Moses. I like that. And make sure that they know that it's not J, E, P, and D. Oh, amazing. And then the parent raises their hand and says, where are you doing that in the classroom? Show me how 9th through 12th grade it's coming up. Oh, it's not. We're going to do like assemblies on it every now and then. We're going to, in the hallways, we're going to have posters of God wrote the Bible. God gave Moses. I think a lot of us would look at that and say, well, that's not a healthy way to make sure that they really know their story. That doesn't seem reasonable. And so that's the analogy that I want us all to be thinking, or that I think about as it relates to Israel.
Can I ask you a question on that before you go further? Because when you talk about the story, I know there's a part 2, but when you talk about teaching the Israel story, let me again ask that distinction between education and advocacy. How much of the good, the bad, and the ugly do you include? Now, I live in Israel. I'm very pro-Israel. I'm not trying to say that Israel is a state that's born in sin. Of course not. That does not mean that Israel has always done everything right. There have been missed opportunities on Israel's side as well. There have been mistakes on Israel's side because we're human beings. It's impossible to be perfect all the time. So in educating high school kids, do you also say this was a mistake, or do you avoid that?
Well, the number one methodology looks like this, okay? In terms of, so we first have to set the how, which is what I spoke about, which is the parenting and teaching. Then we have to go into the why, which is what I spoke about with the J, P, and D and R. And as it relates to, well, if you want them to advocate, they gotta know their stuff. And now comes the how, and that's what you're asking right now. What does the how look like? And the how looks like, is one of my favorite lines ever from Menachem Leibtag, which is sakana kan bonim, that the best way to understand what your educational approach should be based on an Israeli construction site, not Vygotsky, not Piaget, not Soloveitchik or Rav Kook, but an Israeli construction site, which says sakana kan bonim, danger, we're building here. And building requires, and you know what, I'll use another Menachem Leibtag line, which is objective analysis followed by subjective interpretation. So what that means is, what you want to end up doing is you want people to come out with an approach that I call goosebumps with complexity. So you have to go to an Israeli construction site and see what that looks like. Okay. Danger, we're building here. Danger, we're building here. We're asking tough questions. It starts with a foundation, but we're asking tough questions. And these questions are going to get you to think. We're going to be doing a few things. We're going to be intrinsically motivating, and we're going to be posing problems. Okay. So intrinsically motivating means that how do you get someone motivated to care about something? One of the key ways to do that in educational psychology is to present them with ideas discrepantly with how they might have understood it. Great example, 1903, the Uganda plan. If you tell your students, here was what the Uganda plan was. And again, unpack for educators, unpacking Israeli history. It's all there. Okay, here's what the Uganda plan. And then you say, guess who supported it? And then you go through different ideologies. And then you show them, actually, the religious Zionists were the ones that supported it initially. Like, well, that doesn't make any sense. I don't understand that. Now, all of a sudden, they're motivated to want to learn more because you presented ideas discrepantly from how they understood it. Okay. The second thing you want to do is pose problems to them. Ask them to solve it. Ask them. This is from Paulo Freire. Instead of doing what he spoke about as the banking model, depositing information, what we have to do more of is posing problems and ask them to solve it. So let's say a two-state solution, right? How do you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Let's go through potential scenarios. Do you want a federation, a confederation, a two-state solution, a binational state? Well, now here's the history. Let's give the different documents, the different history, the different videos, and then have them solve it. What we have to do in all of this, though, is be what our young people want more than anything. Oh my gosh, more than anything. They just want us to be credible and transparent. They're begging that we're credible and transparent. They don't want to be sold one thing anymore. They really don't. And if you could combine credible and transparent in a culture of care, that they see that you care about them, then my Lord, the learning is on fire. It's on fire. And so the question of good, bad, ugly, it's the history. It's their story. Do they have to learn about Deir Yassin? Yes, they do. Do they have to learn about Deir Yassin as if they're planning on going to university and going to any corporate America and having a family? If it's any of those three things, the answer is yes. They have to learn about it. They have to see the different sides of the history of it. They have to. Kfar Qasim, Kibbutz, Sabra and Shatila, all of it. They have to learn about it. Baruch Goldstein, they have to learn about it. They have to learn the history. If they want to have a relationship with real Israel as opposed to abstract Israel, then yes, they have to learn that history. How they identify, though, I want to continue with what I said earlier, though. It has to be part of their story. It's such an important part. It's their story. It's the Jewish story. And the Jewish story has good, it has bad, it has ugly. And it's within the context of the Zionist story. And they have to have a deep, profound connection with Zionists. You keep on saying, Scott, that you like being pro-Israel. I don't like being pro-Israel. I'm not interested in being pro-Israel. I'm really not. I'm really interested in being Zionist and having a profound connection with Zionism. And I want our young people to be Zionist. Is
Can you explain what you mean by that? What's the difference between being pro-Israel and being a Zionist?
Being pro-Israel means that I support what Israel does, that I'm there on the sideline and saying, go Israel, go Israel, go. And it presents this dynamic of there's pro-Israel and then there's pro-Palestine. And then, I'm going to be one or the other. Like, well, stop. I want to be Zionist. What being Zionist means that is I take matters into my own hand. Being Zionist means I'm not just being rhetorical. It really means It means standing up straight and being an active decision maker and not letting the whims of other governments guide us and tell us what to do. To be Zionist is, like A.B. Yoshua said, it means to have a common platform, not an exclusive ideology. And that common platform is people who get up and they take matters into their own hands. They view that their identity is something that is much more than religious. It's national, that I care deeply about the Jewish people, regardless of if they're atheistic, Haredi, or Sephardic, or Mizrahi, or Ashkenazi. It means that Judaism, it can only be healthy when it combines body and soul with land and ideas. That's what it means to be Zionist. And you could be a secular Zionist. You could believe like Mikhail Yosef Berdichevsky, which is that religion is of the past, or you could be like a Chad Am and say, no, religion has an influence on the present and the future. You could be like Herzl, and you could believe that, Zionism is there to end anti-Semitism. You could be like Jabotinsky and say, no, like Micha Goodman points out about Jabotinsky, that it's about the Zionism is there to protect against anti-Semitism. You could be like a Chad Am and believe that Zionism is there to save Judaism, to make it the spiritual epicenter of world Jewry. Or you could be like Herzl again and say, no, it's not about saving Judaism, it's about saving the Jews. And so, like, it's so much more engaging and romantic. It's like, it's building, it's getting your, let me say it like this: Zionism is getting your fingernails dirty. That's what it is, getting dirt under your fingernails. That's what Zionism is. And I think that we've relinquished Zionism too often in favor of being pro-Israel. And being pro-Israel is it's not so interesting. It's really, like, sorry to say, like, it's not interesting. Being Zionist, oh my gosh, let's go. Game on. Let's get everyone to be Zionists, get their fingernails dirty. And when you get your fingernails dirty, guess what happens? Sometimes people think one way, sometimes people think another way, but it's theirs. They own it. At that point in time, if you're asking people to be pro-Israel, there's compassion fatigue. If you're asking people to be Zionist, no such thing as compassion fatigue, because they're engaged. And so that's what it is to be Zionist. And that's what I'm trying to make sure young people learn, engage with in their classroom, in their curriculum, and everything. That's what it looks like.
I'm going to bring this back now to what we talked about at the beginning about my old yeshiva, Yesodei HaTorah. And we often would distinguish between procedural learning, which is showing someone how it's done, versus skill building, which is what you let the student do it themselves. And for us, procedural learning was teaching Bikiyut, when they watched the teacher read the Gemara and they would see how it's supposed to be done. And the skill building was essentially workshopping, which was morning Seder, which was when they would learn the Gemara on their own. You'd guide them so that they could figure it out, but it was their job to figure it out on their own. On some level, and perhaps I'm going too far here, you're describing Zionism as skill building, as opposed to being pro-Israel, which might be more like procedural learning. Procedural learning, you're learning about, these are the facts I want you to know about Israel. And you're describing something which excites me very much, this concept of skill building, where you are engaged in it. This is yours. You take possession of it yourself. Someone who does skill building Gemara, whether or not they become a Talmid Chacham is a different question, but it's the start. First, they have to feel they have a personal nigiyah, personal stake in the text, and they have a personal connection to it. Yep. It's theirs to mine the way that they want to do so, in an honest way. And you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, that the way we teach Zionism should be much the same kind of way.
Yeah, I want people to see themselves in the story. I want them to see this as part of their identity. I don't want them to see it as something that's external for them to cheer on. That I just don't see that as being something that is A, sustainable, and B, deeply meaningful.
Then let's go to the next question.
Okay.
For someone who has no intention of going to Israel, who doesn't intend to study in Israel for a year, who does not want to move to Israel, how can that person be a deep and caring Zionist living in the United States? I'm not saying it can't happen, but how can you get your fingernails dirty if you're not actually in the place where those fingernails have to get dirty?
Well, I think that people should be spending a lot of time in Israel. I think that's I think that's a majorly important achievement for the Jewish world. I believe birthright is the greatest creation since the creation of the Jewish state in 1948. Like, I think that birthright is so important. Every single young Jew has a birthright to be there. And then programs like Route One, which emerged, I know some people don't know about it. Route One is basically birthright for 16-year-olds and making sure that every young Jew has an opportunity to go to visit Israel over the summer. And so, like, I would say, like, no, you have to be there. I think Jewish people have to show up in Israel. I think that's a major part of it, major part of the identity. Whether or not they make it that their formal abode is secondary, but being there, no, I think it really matters, Scott.
Let me ask you another question, Noam. Are there
Yeah.
particular opportunities that the current moment provides? The Israel education, the Zionist education, which you're developing, is compelling. Post October 7th, are there more opportunities and maybe also more challenges that make it more complicated or maybe even easier in some ways than it was before? What are some of the opportunities and challenges that the current moment provides students in high school?
The opportunity is this. It's enough. It's enough. It's enough to say that we don't have time to teach about Israel and Zionism in our middle schools and high schools. But enough. Figure it out. What I mean is, in the past, it used to be, where do we put Zionism in Israel education? Is it part of secular studies or general studies? Is it part of Judaic studies? I don't know where it fits. People say, you know what, let's shove it into 10th grade between, I don't know, February and April. And it would be additional to, and it would be in the assemblies, but it wouldn't be systemically incorporated. I think we're at the point now that a lot of schools are seeing that it has to be not in addition to, but in place of. I might have my numbers wrong here, but I believe I think there are over between 800 to 900. We have to remember how small we are. Outside of the Haredi world, there's something between 800 to 900 Jewish middle schools and high schools or something like that across the world outside of Israel. It's not that many. We work, Unpack for Educators works with like 560 or so of them. Okay. So that's a lot of that market. What we have found is within that market, we work deeply, deeply, deeply with like 160, 170 of those schools. Okay. And what we've done with those schools is we've seen what the students know and what they don't know, what the teachers are able to do and they're not able to. And I've been blown away by some of these schools that are figuring out a way to say after the 7th of October, we have to make sure that we are implementing it in our schools, that we are making sure that they're learning about Israel and Zionism in their schools. There's an Orthodox school in Teaneck which did unbelievable work with us, where they created 12 lessons on key Israel topics. Actually, I'll give them a shout out on mine. Frisch did this. They did a 12 lessons on key Israel topics. Is Zionism what does it mean to be a Zionist? What are current events in Israel? What are multiple narratives around 1948? How do we think about the 6-Day War, the West Bank, Gaza, Hamas, Oslo, peace, et cetera, et cetera? And they incorporated, they took out of their Gemara classes, right? Not in addition to, but in place of, and they made sure that their students learned about it. I think that is amazing, an amazing moment that they started actually learning about Zionism in a systemic way, and we help them at Unpack for Educators. The challenge is this, though. The challenge is this. I'm nervous about American discourse coarsening, and people going into their camps and parents feeling like they have too much of a say in how things should be taught. Teachers are scared parents, if you're listening, teachers are scared out of their minds of you sometimes. They are scared that they're going to say the wrong thing. They're scared that their tone is going to be misinterpreted. They're scared that if they talk about the difficult topics, you're going to give them a call and say, don't talk about these things. It's my job to teach them about these things. They're scared. My request to your audience, of Scott, is this. Please let the teachers teach. Please let the principals principal and parents parent, and students. Let's remember that the students are at the center of this. We have to make sure that the subject, I think it's Barry Chazan who said this, the subject is not the topic. The subject is the person, right? And the students it's about the student. Let them learn. Let them engage with a more knowledgeable and caring other. Let them go through it. Let them see the different issues within Israel. Let them understand the complexities. Let them see the different sides of the judicial reforms. Let them know what the judicial reforms are. Let them know the challenges of Palestinians living in area A, B, and C, what that looks like, and let them know the history of the different sides of how that happened, how they got there. Let them know about the Palestinian leadership and the challenges of the moment of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, and let them see how the Palestinians have never had what I like to call their Altalena moment, right? And let's make sure that when someone says Altalena moment, you'll know what it means, and that they'll know what it means. And then we could have this shared cultural literacy that is engaging, that's exciting, that's meaningful. So that's what I see as the opportunity. Every single Jewish school in the country has an opportunity to learn with Unpack for Educators and many other great programs that are out there. And it's there. The content is there. The curriculum is there. And parents, I think, let's let the teachers teach.
And I'll just give a quick shout out to my niece, Maya, who is beginning Frisch this week, actually. So
once
you've mentioned Frisch, I'll mention Maya. One last thing, Noam, I've learned so much today. If people are interested in learning more about Unpacked or Unpacked for Educators, how do they find out more?
Okay, so thank you, Scott. So Unpacked, we have multiple YouTube channels. There's Unpacked, which has 275,000 subscribers on YouTube. Today Unpacked, which shows the different perspectives on Israeli and Jewish world current events, another YouTube channel. Big Jewish Ideas, a third YouTube channel about Jewish faith. Unpacked for Educators, that's the go-to spot. If you go to unpacked.education, it has curriculum, content. It's all free. It's all free. So, like, I'm not selling anything. It's all free. We launched a new division for non-Jewish schools, which I'll talk about another time. It's called Connect Ed, not for now. That's incredibly exciting. And then the podcasts, Unpacking Israeli History, which is the podcast that I host, which is you're really amazing to see millions of people starting to learn their history of Israel through this podcast, Packing Israeli History, which as you could hear, is so important, and Wandering Jews with Michal Biton. If you don't know Michal Biton, you're missing out on a major Jewish scholar. Scott, I think she was on your podcast. Is that right?
Yeah, she was. She was on a few months ago, yes.
Okay, so Wandering Jews is the other podcast that I host.
And she's great.
Michal Biton, and she's brilliant, and I get to learn with her and bother her every now and then as well. So check it all out.
Well, Noam, you really gave me a lot to think about today, and I'm sure, like me, everybody listening is thinking more about the right ways of teaching about Israel, the difference between Zionism and being pro-Israel, the importance of teaching about Israel, and I appreciate your giving us so much food for thought. Dr. Noam Weissman, thank you for joining me today.
Scott, thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.